And joining me now is Stacey Abrams, who is the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia. She's in a rematch with Brian Kemp, who defeated her 4 years ago very narrowly. Ms. Abrams, welcome back to Meet the Press.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Look, let's start. This lead conversation is about the impact of what we saw in Kansas and obviously post-Dobbs. How front and center do you believe the abortion debate should be for Democrats all around the country, let alone your campaign?
It is an essential conversation. It is about the freedom of women to direct their lives. It is about healthcare freedom, and it is cutting across demographics. It's cutting across ideology. It is cutting across the questions that so often dominate elections at this moment, because for women, this is a healthcare conversation. It is an economic conversation. It is also just a conversation about whether our citizenship is equal to men in this country, depending on which state you live in.
You know, it's interesting. You even seem to be arguing it's like, look, the ups and downs of the economy, you know, that may motivate you on one hand, but hey, these laws are longer term. I mean, do you even think abortion, in your mind, the abortion issue, almost bigger than the economy long term?
I would say that the economic vicissitudes are going to continue. And I would never underplay how important it is for us to think about putting money in people's pockets and putting a roof over their heads. But we know that for women, these abortion rights fights are about their ability to control their lives, to have the ability to participate in the economy, to have the ability to determine whether forced pregnancy is in their future. And so, yes, I would urge every voter to think about the economy is going to go up and down, but these laws, when they become solidified, change the future for every woman that you know.
I want to get some clarity on your position specifically, because you've said this. I want to put up what you said very recently on your abortion position. You said this: my intention is going to be to pass legislation that says a woman has the right to an abortion, and that right continues until a physician determines the fetus is viable outside of the body, except in the case of protecting the woman's life or health. How do you put legislation around that?
You put legislation around that by returning to what we know was the structural framework of Roe v. Wade. You do it by not setting arbitrary gestational limits, because we know that those rarely actually reflect medical decision making. This is a medical decision. And when we give it back to doctors, when we tell women and their doctors to make these choices, what we are saying is we respect the responsibility that women have and the obligation that doctors have, but that politicians are not scientists, and that we should not be setting into law these moving targets that do not reflect the reality that women face when they're sitting in that doctor's office.
Look, the person on the right who wants to see some restrictions on abortion is going to argue that even though you're not saying you're for abortion all the way up to the end of, that essentially that law would allow abortion all the way up to the end of a pregnancy. Would you want to have legislation to put guardrails on that?
The guardrails are holding the physician accountable. And that's the place where I think we've gotten a bit far afield. Mm-hmm. There is no woman who at 8 months has not cherished the notion of this pregnancy. If you have conversations with women, you know that that is one of the most difficult moments. And the reality is that to put an arbitrary date in a law devalues the pain and the tragedy of that moment. A doctor is not going to take an action that is not medically required. Mm-hmm. And what we are saying is that this is a medical decision. I understand that there are those who would feel better if we plucked a date out of the air, but we know that that is not scientifically supportable. But we also know that the tragedy of exceptions, you cannot write every exception into the law, and that is where we find ourselves today in Georgia. Brian Kemp does not permit these exceptions to be real. And in a state where we have 82 counties without an OBGYN, 64 counties without a surgeon, 18 counties without a family doctor, and 9 without a doctor at all, setting arbitrary limits that are not grounded in the reality of what women face is deeply problematic and ultimately cruel.
So this is where, I mean, you're having a science conversation and a medical conversation, which is the conversation most women are having. There's also the political reality. If you get elected governor, you're going to have probably a Republican legislature. So in order to, you may have to compromise in order to get a better law that won't be what you want. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to essentially go from what it is now to 15 weeks, if that's what you're able to do as governor, because that's the legislature? You You write your laws with the legislature that you have, not the one that you want.
Where we stood in Georgia prior to Brian Kemp was a 20-week ban that I also found deeply objectionable. But what Brian Kemp has done is go so far afield that 72% of women, 72% of Georgians disagree with what we have right now, which is almost a total ban. When you say 6-week ban, it's about 54%. But when you understand that it is roughly a total ban on abortion, we know that regardless of your political posture, you disagree with where we are. As someone who served in the legislature for 11 years and was lauded by both parties for my ability to navigate, I will certainly get the best law we can, but we begin making decisions based on what it should be. And then, yes, of course, you work towards what you can get. But we have to start with a governor who actually believes that a woman should have the right to control her body and to control her economic freedom.
What I'm just trying to get at here is you're not going to be rigid to the point of if you don't get it your way, you're not going to change the law.
That's not how politics has ever worked, unless, of course, you're Brian Kemp, who believes that your extreme agenda should trump everyone else's decision-making and everyone else's needs.
Let me ask you quickly about your race. There is a pattern developing. If you just look at the polling, Raphael Warnock seems to have a steady lead on Herschel Walker. Brian Kemp and all those same polls seems to have a narrow lead on you. It does appear as if he's got a little bit of acquired some Teflon by taking on Trump. Is that making it a little bit harder to defeat him this year? Is that it's harder to make him a Trump ally?
Brian Kemp is doing an excellent job of showing that he is an extremist who has a hard right agenda that is not in the best interest of Georgia. We just lost Music Midtown, $50 million coming out of our economy because Brian Kemp weakened gun laws in Georgia at a time where guns are the #1 killer of our children, and gun violence, we are the #9 state for gun violence. What he has benefited from is having, yes, a primary that was fairly lackluster in the end, but what people are realizing and why he remains below 50% is that Georgians realize we do not have to make a choice between a strong economy and an extremist agenda. I'm the only candidate who is proposing a comprehensive plan for how we build our economy and protect our freedoms. Brian Kemp refuses to do so. And so I believe that this election, as we move into Labor Day, that people are going to continue to pay attention to his extreme position on abortion, his extreme position on guns, his extreme position on refusing to take action to help the people of Georgia when we are suffering from a healthcare crisis and a housing crisis. And that the more they pay attention, the more they will realize that his high water mark was on that primary day.
All right. Stacey Abrams, in a race that we will all be watching very closely from here. Thanks for coming on. Stay safe on the trail.
Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.